The morning light spilled softly through the thin curtains of my little cabin, painting golden streaks across the worn wooden floor and catching the dust motes that danced lazily in the air. And for a moment, I allowed myself to breathe, to feel the quiet rhythm of life before it pulled me into chaos. My 2 pups, small and trembling from the chill of the night before, huddled near the hearth, their soft whimpers mingling with the crackle of the fire, and I traced my fingers over their fur, murmuring comfort in the low, steady tone that had become my shield against the harshness of the world. Outside, the forest stretched endlessly, a mosaic of evergreens and mist, the same place I had walked countless times without thinking twice. Yet today it seemed alive with whispers, a murmur beneath the wind, as if the trees themselves carried messages I could not yet understand. I glanced toward the edge of the clearing, half expecting to see nothing, and yet there it was, a flicker of movement, subtle, deliberate, almost imperceptible, that drew my attention despite my tired eyes. Kael. I had only ever seen him in glimpses, a shadow at the edge of my vision, a pair of glowing red eyes in the darkness that vanished whenever I looked directly, leaving behind an echo of presence that clung to the edges of my mind. He had never spoken, never approached, yet I could feel him there, observing, calculating, and something about his silent vigilance stirred both fear and fascination within me, as if he were a guardian of truths I was not yet ready to face. I shook my head, telling myself it was a trick of the morning mist, a reflection in the frost along the window, yet the sensation of being watched remained, an intangible weight pressing gently against the quiet bubble of my life. My hands, busy with mending the rips in the boy's clothes, seemed to tremble despite the warmth of the hearth, and the sound of the needle-piercing cloth echoed unnaturally loud in the stillness, as though the room itself had held its breath, waiting. Outside, the wind carried scents I recognized, the earthiness of damp soil, the faint metallic tang of a creek that ran near the cabin, the sweet decay of fallen leaves, but beneath them was something else, a presence more primal, more urgent, that made my chest tighten and my thoughts race. Kael's eyes, I imagined, reflected all the things I could not name, all the fears and hopes I had tucked away in corners of my heart too small for anyone else to see, and yet here he was, silent and constant, a reminder that nothing in this forest or perhaps in life was ever as ordinary as it seemed. I moved to the window and pressed my forehead to the cool glass, my reflection blurry, the morning sun casting long shadows across my face, and I wondered if the world I knew, the world of chores and quiet nights and whispered lullabies, was only the surface of something larger, something hidden in the folds of the woods beyond. A sudden rustle in the underbrush made me startle, and I froze, listening to the rhythm of my own heartbeat, the way the pups stirred against me, the way the forest seemed to inhale and exhale in a single synchronized breath. There was a snap of a twig, soft, deliberate, a sound that seemed out of place in the familiar grove, and though I saw nothing, I could feel Kael's presence shift, subtle but unmistakable, a silent acknowledgement that he too had noticed, that he too was aware of currents moving beneath the surface of the ordinary. I wanted to call out, to demand that he show himself, but the sound of my own voice seemed sacrilegious in the fragile stillness, and instead I whispered to the pups, reminding them that we were safe here, that the world outside the cabin's thin walls was nothing to fear, even as my own certainty wavered. Something about the air felt charged, like the calm before a storm, but not the kind of storm that rattled the trees or tore through the earth. This was a storm of fate, of unseen threads pulling me forward into paths I could not yet perceive. I went about my morning routine mechanically, filling the kettle, sweeping the floor, feeding the pups, each motion deliberate, almost ritualistic, as though the mundane could anchor me against the strange pulse I felt in the woods beyond. And still Kael watched. I did not see him, not really, but I felt him in the brush, in the shimmer of the mist, in the subtle tension that hung beneath the familiar landscape. His presence was a question without an answer, a shadow that promised revelation without revealing its form, and I felt an inexplicable pull, a curiosity mingled with caution, threading through my thoughts like the soft, relentless wind that whispered through the cabin cracks. As the morning wore on, I imagined his glowing red eye in every reflective surface, the kettle, the window, the silverware laid out for breakfast, and with each imagined glance, I felt an uneasy thrill, a sense that my life, long measured in routines and small comforts, was on the brink of being touched by something larger, something unknowable. And just as I carried the pups outside to breathe in the crisp air and listen to the creek gurgle past, I thought I glimpsed movement at the far edge of the clearing, a dark shape slipping behind the trees, and I whispered their names softly, my pulse quickening, and the forest seemed to hold its breath alongside me. Kael's presence was near yet unreachable, a promise and a warning entwined, and I realized, with a sudden clarity that made my heart both race and ache, that my ordinary world, the quiet mornings, the small hearth, the fragile routines, was only the first chapter, and that the real story, the one that would challenge my instincts and pull at the edges of my courage, was already beginning. Somewhere in the shadows, he waited, and I knew, without knowing how, that the day I had always feared and longed for had arrived quietly, unannounced, and that the mystery lingering in the forest would soon sweep me into a path I could not yet imagine, a path watched, guided, and perhaps judged by the rogue wolf whose secrets were as dark as the soil beneath my feet. And as the sun rose fully above the trees, casting the world in warm light, I felt a chill that no fire could chase away, a thrill of anticipation that hummed through my veins, and a quiet voice at the edge of my mind seemed to murmur, almost inaudibly, "They will come, and you will not be ready." The days that followed slipped into a strange rhythm, as if the forest itself had shifted while I slept, each morning feeling familiar and yet subtly askew, and I found myself noticing things that would have gone unnoticed before. The way the wind seemed to pause in certain corners of the woods, carrying scents and whispers that my mind could not fully decipher, or the way my pups would shiver at sounds that did not exist, their tiny bodies tensing as if aware of a presence invisible to me. I had begun my daily walks along the creek, letting the water soothe my restless thoughts when I first noticed it, an echo of movement that did not belong, a shadow flickering across the undergrowth just beyond the periphery of my vision, so fleeting that I could never be certain if it was real, yet undeniable in its insistence. There, as always, was Kael, just beyond reach, a dark shape blending with the forest, his glowing red eye reflecting the sunlight in a momentary flash before vanishing behind the trees, leaving behind a sense of both warning and fascination, a silent imprint on my consciousness that made the hairs on my arms rise. Strange emotions began to stir within me, a pull toward the unknown, an ache in my chest that felt like hope and dread intertwined, and I could not ignore the way my heart quickened when the forest seemed to hum with unseen energy. Each day brought subtle signs, fallen leaves arranged in patterns too deliberate to be accidental, ripples on the creek that seemed to move against the current, and the way the wind carried whispers that my ears could not fully catch, fleeting syllables that vanished before they could be understood. The mechanic, the man I had glimpsed that first morning, became a strange constant in the periphery of my life, though I had not spoken to him directly. I sensed his presence in the way the forest seemed calmer when he was near, as if the land itself recognized the strength in his quiet resolve. And always, Kael lingered at the edge, silent, patient, and impossibly observant, leaving subtle signs that my mind could only half perceive. A fallen branch that pointed toward a hidden path, a flash of red in the shadows that seemed to vanish when I blinked, or the low, almost imperceptible growl that seemed carried on the wind, warning and beckoning all at once. I began to dream in colors I had never seen, visions of the forest layered with strange light, where dark shapes moved in tandem with my heartbeat and eyes like Kael's glowed from hidden corners, and each morning I awoke with the echo of whispers pressing against my mind, as if the world were trying to tell me something I was not yet ready to hear. My pups, too, seemed attuned to these changes. They would stop mid-step, ears perked, gazing toward the shadows, tails stiff, and I felt their small bodies tremble with a mixture of fear and recognition, as if they too could sense the pull of forces that lay just beyond understanding. I tried to carry on, to maintain the routines that had always grounded me, the sweeping of the floor, preparing food, checking traps along the creek, but the ordinary motions felt hollow, as though I were moving through a life that no longer fully belonged to me, a prelude to something larger, unfolding beyond my comprehension. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the forest in molten gold and shadow, I glimpsed Kael again, crouched on a ridge above the creek, his dark form stark against the fading light, the red glow of his eye catching mine for a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, and I could swear I saw him nod ever so slightly, a gesture that conveyed knowledge and intent I could not yet grasp. The forest seemed to hold its breath with me, every leaf suspended mid-sway, every ripple frozen in the water, and I felt a shiver run through me as if the moment itself were a message, unspoken yet heavy with meaning. That night, I awoke to the sound of rustling just beyond the cabin, the kind of sound that usually heralded nothing more than the wind or a passing animal, but this time it carried weight, cadence, and purpose, a rhythm that resonated with the pulse of my own heart. I peered into the darkness, seeing only shadows shifting against the moonlight, Yet I knew, because I had come to trust the instinct that Kael seemed to leave in his wake, that he had been there, watching, waiting, and that the path I thought I understood was no longer my own. A sudden breeze pressed against the window, carrying with it the faintest hint of something metallic, like distant iron against stone. A scent that raised the hairs on my neck and made my pups whimper softly, and I shivered despite the fire burning low in the hearth. Kael's presence was tangible, a silent thread that wove through the ordinary, connecting moments that felt isolated and mundane into a pattern I could not yet decipher. As I sat there holding my pups close, I felt the pulse of destiny press gently against the edges of my awareness, a quiet insistence that change was coming, that life as I had known it was shifting beneath my feet, guided by forces I could not see but could feel in every heartbeat, every shadow, every flicker of the forest around me. And then just before sleep claimed me entirely, I saw it. A movement at the far edge of the clearing, too precise to be random, too deliberate to be coincidence. A flash of red in the darkness, like the eye of a flame in the night, watching, waiting, patient and unyielding, and I realized with a quiet thrill and a tremor of fear that Kael's presence was no longer simply observation, but a prelude, a harbinger of the paths and choices that would soon converge around me, and I wondered, half in awe and half in dread, whether I was ready for the life that awaited just beyond the shadows, a life that had already begun to ripple through my world even as I clung to the fragile illusion of ordinary mornings, ordinary nights, and ordinary hearts. The morning air was crisp with the promise of change, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine as I trudged along the narrow path toward the creek, my pups clinging to me for warmth and comfort. When I saw him, the alpha, he emerged from the trees as if he had always belonged there, tall and solid, every movement measured and magnetic, his presence filling the forest with a gravity that made my breath catch and the world seem to slow for a heartbeat. His hair caught the sunlight like molten bronze, his eyes a piercing shade of amber that seemed to see through everything I had tried to hide from the world, and when he noticed us, the way he smiled was gentle yet commanding, an unspoken assurance that we were safe, that the weight of our struggles could be carried, even if only for a moment. I felt my heart thrum in ways I hadn't known it could, a strange mixture of caution, wonder, and something I could not yet name, as the alpha crouched just enough to meet the gaze of my pups, his hands moving slowly, deliberately, giving them room to sense trust before any words were spoken. And then I saw it, a flicker in the corner of my eye, red and unyielding, impossible to miss once noticed. Kael stood at the edge of the clearing, a shadow against the light, glowing left eye fixed on the alpha, and a low, almost inaudible murmur floated through the forest, carried on a breath of wind, so soft I could have imagined it. Your alpha isn't who you think he is. My pulse leapt, not from fear, but from the strange and undeniable weight of his words, like a stone dropped into the depths of my chest that refused to settle, forcing my thoughts to unravel and reorder in ways I could not yet understand. The alpha extended his hand to us and instinctively I took it, letting him guide us to a small sheltered nook near the creek where the earth was dry and soft, where moss cushioned the pups as they rested against his legs, feeling the first warmth of true safety in what had seemed like an endless world of need and uncertainty. Every movement he made was precise, every glance calculated yet humane, a contrast to the raw wildness of the forest surrounding us, and I could not help but notice the tension between the calm he exuded and the storm I sensed just beneath the surface, a strength restrained but ready to command. Kael, silent and distant, moved along the tree-line, appearing and disappearing like smoke in the morning mist, watching, waiting, and his presence was a constant reminder that no interaction, no moment, existed without a consequence I could not yet perceive. The alpha began to speak, his voice deep and melodic, explaining little but conveying so much, assurances that our survival mattered, hints that the forest itself could be a place of refuge if one understood its rhythm, and beneath the surface, a subtle acknowledgement that our lives were about to intersect in ways beyond simple chance. As he leaned closer to observe the pups, a soft gust carried the faintest whisper through the trees, Kael's voice again threading into my consciousness. Some paths are visible only when the unseen moves first, and it left me shivering with the knowledge that the alpha, no matter how comforting or magnetic, was only a part of a larger story already written in the hidden layers of the forest. I watched the alpha with a mixture of awe and caution, noting the way he carried himself, how his amber eyes flicked to every sound, every movement, and I realized that he commanded respect not with fear but with presence, with an energy that could soothe yet dominate, a duality I found impossible to resist. The pups, sensing his strength and warmth, leaned into him, their small bodies curling against his legs, and I felt the tight knot of fear I had carried for weeks begin to loosen just enough to leave room for trust, yet the echo of Kael's words lingered, reminding me that appearances could be deceiving, and that the forest had more secrets than it allowed to be known at first glance. Even as I studied the alpha, I became aware of every shift in the shadows, every flicker of light on leaves, every sound of branches bending with the wind, and I knew Kael was still there, silently observing, a guardian or a herald, a warning or a guide, leaving signs that I could barely perceive yet somehow understood at a gut level. The alpha knelt to gather some fallen moss to cushion the pups further, his hands brushing lightly across the earth, and in that motion I saw more than strength. I saw intention, care, and a connection to the land that resonated in ways I could not articulate, a harmony that was almost musical in its subtlety, a melody that seemed to answer the forest's own rhythm. Kael's presence felt to me like the quiet accompaniment to that melody, a low counterpoint that reminded me that nothing existed in isolation, that each act, each breath, each moment of trust was part of a larger composition I was only beginning to perceive. I felt an unspoken tension crackle between the alpha and Kael, invisible yet electric, like the charge before lightning strikes, and my curiosity surged, mingled with the thrill of danger I could not name, for the forest had begun to hum with purpose, and I was no longer merely a wanderer or a survivor. I was becoming a part of a story that demanded attention, instinct, and courage. And just as the sun fully emerged from the horizon, casting gold over the creek and illuminating the alpha's figure in a near-holy light, Kael moved again, stepping into a clearing just beyond our reach, and his glowing red eye fixed on me for the briefest of moments, a silent acknowledgement, a question, and a warning all in one, leaving me breathless and trembling, knowing with an instinct deeper than thought that the choices I made in the moments ahead would ripple far beyond my understanding, and that the alpha's magnetic presence, though comforting and commanding, was only the beginning of a series of events shaped by forces I could not yet see. And as I watched him stand, the amber of his gaze meeting mine, a shiver ran down my spine, carrying the sense that destiny was waiting not just at my feet but in the shadows beyond, in the silent observer whose secrets I was only beginning to glimpse, and I felt the first true stirrings of a connection that would change everything I thought I knew about trust, strength, and the hidden layers of the world I had always called home, leaving me on the edge of wonder, fear, and anticipation for the next step that fate was preparing me to take. The forest no longer felt familiar, though it remained the same in every measurable detail. Each morning the mist seemed thicker, the trees taller, and the shadows deeper, as though the world had expanded while I slept, carrying with it a weight I could feel pressing against my chest and stirring my thoughts in ways I could not yet name. And even the creek, which had once whispered comfort in its gentle, constant murmur, now carried hints of something unseen, a tension that tightened with every ripple, every reflection of sunlight on water. My dreams had begun to shift too, blending the known with the impossible. Visions of the alpha standing at the edge of a cliff, the wind tearing through his hair as his amber eyes glowed with unspoken purpose. Flashes of Kael lurking behind trees, red eye glinting like a warning, and fleeting images of the forest alive with movement, shadows stretching in ways the day could never reproduce, all leaving me with a lingering ache of anticipation and unease that clung to my waking hours. Coincidences began to pile one upon another, impossible to ignore, like the way the alpha would appear near the creek at the precise moment I felt overwhelmed, or how the wind would shift just enough to carry the scent of Kael's presence along with the smell of earth and pine, and each time I glimpsed the rogue wolf, whether in the distance or in the edge of a shadow, I felt a chill of recognition, a reminder that I was being observed, guided, or tested, though the rules of such tests remained hidden. I noticed my pups responding too, their instincts sharper than mine, ears twitching at sounds I could not hear, bodies freezing as if warning of dangers invisible to the eye. And yet I trusted the alpha and the forest enough to let them explore, to feel the thrill of freedom mingled with caution, a delicate balance I sensed Kael watching, approving or disapproving in subtle movements I was only beginning to perceive. Even small routines began to feel transformed. Sweeping the floor, gathering water, lighting the fire, all mundane acts became charged with significance, and the forest seemed to respond to my presence, to the rhythm of my breathing and heartbeat, as if the trees themselves were alive and aware, holding their breath for the next move in a story written in whispers and shadows. I began hearing soft murmurs in the wind, syllables I could not fully catch, like a language half remembered from a distant past, And I felt Kael's gaze even when I could not see him, pressing against my thoughts with a gentle insistence that demanded attention, that warned me not to take the ordinary for granted. For the world I had relied on as safe and predictable was shifting, reshaping itself into something more complex and dangerous. Dreams bled into waking hours. I would see glimpses of the Alpha's path through the forest before he arrived, flashes of movement in the undergrowth, a glowing red eye at the edge of a clearing, and I realized that coincidence was no longer a simple alignment of chance but a language of fate, one that Kael seemed fluent in, leaving hints, symbols, and questions for me to interpret or ignore at my peril. The emotional surges were sudden and intense, a rhythm of fear, longing, and exhilaration that left my chest tight and my thoughts scattered, as though the very essence of life had become charged with unseen energy, pushing me toward choices I did not yet understand, guiding me along paths I could not see but somehow knew were unavoidable. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of violet and gold, I saw Kael perched silently on a ridge above the creek, the red of his eye catching the fading light, and a whisper carried on the wind reached my ears. "You cannot stay in the world you knew." The words sank deep into me, not as a threat but as an undeniable truth, a warning that the delicate balance of ordinary life was gone, replaced by currents that demanded I pay attention, that required courage, instinct, and trust. I began noticing signs in the environment, the way branches bent in patterns that mirrored my thoughts, how birds flew in sudden arcs as if pointing the way forward, how the water rippled against rocks in a rhythm that felt like a pulse, a heartbeat I could feel in my own chest, and each sign seemed designed to push me toward realization, toward awareness of the truth that had always hovered just out of reach. Even the Alpha's presence became layered with new meaning. His careful glances, his quiet movements through the forest, and the way he instinctively protected the pups felt like more than instinct, more than kindness. It was guidance, an anchor in a world I was beginning to understand as fluid, mutable, and alive. And yet the red eye of Kael in the distance reminded me that even guidance came with its own perils, that observation and secrecy carried weight, and that trust was a currency to be earned cautiously. A sense of inevitability began to settle in, like the forest itself was breathing with purpose, and I realized that my life, once predictable and contained within walls of routine and necessity, was unraveling in order to be rewoven into a larger tapestry, one that involved the Alpha, my pups, and the shadowy figure whose secrets I could only glimpse in flashes of crimson and shadow. That night, as I lay awake listening to the wind through the trees and the faint murmur of the creek, I felt a shift within myself, a recognition that I had been living in half-truths, that the ordinary world I had clung to was a fragile illusion, and that every heartbeat, every breath, every small act of care for my pups was now part of a greater narrative already set in motion. Kael's red eye glimmered in the darkness outside the cabin window, a silent sentinel reminding me that observation was constant, that the forest was never empty, that every choice I made rippled outward in ways I could not yet understand, and that change was not just approaching. It had arrived, wrapped in shadow, in instinct, and in the subtle, inexorable pulse of destiny. And as I watched the first stars shimmer through the canopy, reflecting in the creek like scattered jewels, I felt a sudden clarity, a realization that my life could no longer remain as it had been, that the ordinary was gone, and that everything I had taken for granted, the quiet mornings, the steady rhythm of survival, the fragile sense of safety, had shifted irrevocably, leaving me standing on the edge of a world larger, darker, and infinitely more alive than I had ever imagined, with Kael's presence lingering like a question without an answer and the quiet hum of fate pressing insistently against my mind, whispering that the journey I had begun was only the first step into a life I could no longer control, only follow. The forest had begun to feel like a living companion, the trees bending gently with the wind as if acknowledging the rhythm of our days, and within that shifting world, the presence of the Alpha, the mechanic whose hands once only mended engines, became a steady current in my life, a force both grounding and exhilarating, and I found myself noticing the small gestures he made, the way he handed a warm blanket to my pups with careful patience, the soft inflection in his voice when he spoke to me, assuring me that even the heaviest burdens could be carried when shared, and the quiet laughter that slipped through the spaces between words, filling the forest with a warmth I had long thought impossible. Each moment spent near him carried weight, and I felt my chest tighten with a strange mixture of trust and uncertainty, my mind torn between the comfort of familiarity and the thrill of connection. Yet Kael remained at the edges of my awareness, The rogue wolf a silent sentinel whose red eye occasionally caught mine from the shadows, reminding me that even as bonds grew, danger and secrets lingered just beyond the light. I watched the alpha work, hands skilled and precise, whether repairing a simple wheel or clearing a path through the underbrush, and I felt a pull toward him I could not fully explain, a recognition that his strength was not only in his body but in the way he held himself, the unspoken courage that anchored him in moments when the forest whispered of unseen forces and distant threats. My pups warmed to him quickly, their small bodies leaning into his presence, tails brushing his legs, eyes bright with the trust one had taught them to withhold from strangers, and I felt my heart lift and ache simultaneously, marveling at the subtle magic of connection, the kind that could heal hunger, fear, and loneliness without a word, simply through intention and care. And always, Kael was there, a shadow slipping between the trees, a faint rustle in the underbrush, or a subtle pattern left in fallen leaves that drew my attention without explanation, as if guiding me to notice, to interpret, to understand that even the strongest bonds existed within a larger web of destiny. One afternoon, as the sun filtered through the canopy in shards of gold, the alpha paused beside me at the creek, crouching to let my pups drink first, and I felt the gentle heat of his hand brush mine as he returned the water bowl to the ground, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver through me I could neither name nor control, and in that silence words seemed unnecessary, the forest itself seemed to lean closer, carrying the weight of emotion between us like a tangible force. He spoke then, quietly, not of grand declarations but of small truths, how he had once wandered aimlessly, how he had never thought to care for another beyond necessity, and how meeting us, encountering the forest in this way, had opened a part of him he had kept locked away, hidden beneath routine and survival. I listened, heart clenching and expanding at once, recognizing the fragility behind his strength, the vulnerability beneath the commanding presence, and in return, I offered fragments of my own story, my voice low and careful, not exposing all but revealing enough that he could sense the texture of my life, the weight of loss, and the fragile hope that still stirred in my chest despite hunger, fear, and exhaustion. Kael's presence was subtle but insistent. A fallen branch shaped like an arrow pointed toward a hidden path, a flash of red in the shadows just long enough to catch my eye, and a whisper that seemed to float on the wind. Trust does not erase what lies ahead. Each sign reminded me that the bond forming between the alpha and me, though beautiful and essential, existed within a web of forces I could not fully understand, that even connection carried consequences and choices that rippled outward in ways I was only beginning to glimpse. That evening, as we gathered wood for the fire and the pups curled into our legs, the alpha reached out to steady me when I stumbled over a root, and I noticed the slight hesitation in his eyes, a question unspoken yet heavy with meaning, as if he too recognized the depth of the tether forming between us, a force neither of us could ignore or control, yet both of us felt compelled to honor. Laughter and conversation flowed then, gentle, unforced, and I felt the rare joy of belonging, a sense of being anchored in a way I had never known before. Yet beneath the surface, a current of tension hummed, subtle and insistent, a reminder that the forest, and the rogue wolf who watched from the shadows, held truths I had not yet uncovered. And just when the comfort of the evening seemed complete, Kael moved closer, unseen but felt, and I sensed a pulse of warning, a red gleam in the periphery of my mind, accompanied by a whisper that slid into my thoughts like smoke. Not all paths are as they seem. Some hearts carry more than they reveal. My pulse jumped and I looked toward the trees, catching nothing but the shifting shadows, yet the words lodged in my chest, leaving me unsettled even as the warmth of firelight and the presence of the alpha surrounded me. It was then, in the quiet pause of the night, with the pups asleep and the stars trembling above the canopy, that the alpha turned toward me, eyes steady and amber, and spoke with a seriousness that pulled my entire being taut. He confessed a fear, one he had never shared with anyone, not even himself fully, that protecting those he cared for could expose him to vulnerabilities he could not yet face, that his life, once solitary and measured by routine, had been irrevocably altered by the arrival of us into his world. And in that moment I felt a swell of emotion I had not expected. A deep, resonant connection that transcended words or gestures, a recognition that the threads binding us were more than chance, more than the forest, more than even the lurking presence of Kael, whose glowing eye now lingered in my memory like a question mark that refused to fade. The revelation settled over me, a quiet shock that shifted the center of my ordinary life and illuminated the truth I had not yet admitted to myself. that I had found not only safety and kindness in this alpha but a mirror to my own courage, a reflection of hope I had long thought lost, and that even the rogue wolf's warnings, the subtle signs, the shadows and red glimmers in the periphery, were guiding me toward understanding something fundamental, that bonds could be forged in quiet moments, in gestures and trust, and that what I had considered ordinary life was now irrevocably entwined with forces beyond my control, compelling me to acknowledge that the journey ahead would not only test our connection but reveal the hidden layers of destiny that had been waiting silently in the forest, in the shadows, and in the glowing eye of the wolf who never truly left. The forest had shifted again overnight, though the changes were imperceptible at first, like a low hum beneath the rustle of leaves, a rhythm that seemed to pulse with hidden meaning. And as I walked toward the creek with my pups clinging to my sides, I felt an unusual tension in the air, a kind of expectation that made my pulse quicken and my senses stretch beyond the ordinary. The sunlight fractured through the trees differently, the shadows seemed deeper, and every sound, the snap of a twig, the distant cry of a bird, was amplified with significance, as though the world itself was whispering truths I had not yet learned to hear. I paused near a grove I had passed countless times, my gaze drawn to a place where the moss seemed unnaturally bright, almost like a marker, and there, subtly etched into the earth as if by some unseen hand, I noticed symbols that carried an energy I could feel but not understand, and for a heartbeat I thought I was imagining it, until a low rustle in the underbrush confirmed I was not alone. Kael emerged from the shadows just long enough to let the faint glow of his red eye catch mine, a silent signal that carried weight, a message that was part warning, part guidance. The truth you seek is closer than you know, yet closer still than you dare to face. The words, though unspoken aloud, resonated with a certainty that made my breath catch, pressing against the corners of my mind with a force that left me trembling. My thoughts raced, trying to reconcile the ordinary life I had lived with the strange, persistent pulse of destiny pressing against me, and I realized with a sudden sharp clarity that the Alpha, the one who had so effortlessly drawn my trust, my admiration, and the quiet stirrings of my heart, was not merely a protector of flesh and bone, but a figure entwined in something far larger, a presence whose role in the forest and its hidden currents was more complex than I had ever imagined. As I followed the faint trail Kael's presence seemed to suggest, moving almost unconsciously deeper into the grove, I noticed subtle signs that had always been overlooked, a pattern in the rocks along the creek that mirrored the Alpha's movements from days past, the way fallen leaves traced a path toward a hollowed tree that seemed too deliberate to be accidental, and the whispered language of the wind, carrying fragments of what I later realized were prophecies long etched into the forest's memory. The Alpha arrived silently, appearing behind me as though he had always known I would find this place, and his amber eyes widened with recognition, though not of surprise but of acknowledgement, as if he too had waited for this moment to arrive, a confluence of choice and destiny neither of us had yet fully understood. He spoke softly, explaining fragments of the forest's history, tales of guardianship and hidden bonds, of pacts and power, of prophecies written in silence and shadow, and I listened, heart pounding with a mixture of awe and fear, the weight of truth pressing against the fragile structures of my ordinary world. All the while, Kael remained at the edge of the clearing, silent and still, yet I could feel his influence in every rustle of leaves, every flicker of shadow, every instinctual pull that guided me closer to understanding. And then came the revelation, sudden and undeniable. The Alpha's lineage was tied to an ancient prophecy, one that spoke of a guardian who would cross paths with a Luna lost to the ordinary world, whose choices would shape the survival and harmony of the pack and the forest beyond, and the realization struck me like lightning. Our meeting, our bond, the very events that had seemed random, had been orchestrated by forces larger than our comprehension, woven into the very rhythm of the forest itself. My pups stirred at my side, sensing the shift in energy, the tension that rippled through the air like invisible threads, and I felt a surge of protectiveness unlike anything I had experienced, a fierce awareness that the weight of prophecy and the delicate balance of trust rested in my hands as much as his. Kael stepped from the shadows just enough to let his red eye gleam fully in the fading light, and for a moment, I saw more than observation in his presence. I saw understanding, recognition, and perhaps approval, as though the rogue wolf knew what lay ahead and was preparing me for it, leaving hints in subtle gestures, patterns in the undergrowth, and the softest whispers in the wind, his influence both comforting and unnerving. And then the forest itself seemed to speak, the creek swelling slightly as though in exclamation, the trees shivering in unison, and a sudden gust carried the scent of iron and moss, of something ancient and unseen, brushing against my skin and sending a shiver down my spine. The Alpha looked at me then, his expression heavy with the weight of knowledge, and for the first time, I sensed that his quiet strength masked not only responsibility but a vulnerability born of secrets and choices he could not yet share. My breath caught as he gestured to the hollowed tree, where a faint glow emanated from within, revealing a series of carvings that neither of us could have noticed before, lines and symbols that pulsed with energy and meaning, telling a story of guardianship, destiny, and trials to come, and I realized in that instant that my understanding of reality had shifted irrevocably. The forest, the Alpha, Kael, the prophecy, all of it was intertwined, a delicate lattice of fate that demanded attention, courage, and trust beyond anything I had known. And just as the light faded further, leaving long shadows that stretched like fingers across the forest floor, Kael's red eye flashed one final time before disappearing behind the trees, and the forest went quiet, but the sensation of being observed and guided lingered, pressing against my awareness with a weight I could neither ignore nor dismiss. In that silence, the Alpha stepped closer, voice low but urgent, and revealed a single truth that shattered the perceptions I had held so carefully. There was more at stake than survival, more than safety, more than our daily lives, and the path I had believed I was choosing freely had, in fact, been laid by forces both seen and unseen, pulling me into a role I had never imagined I would play. The revelation settled over me like a sudden storm, a mix of awe, fear, and clarity, leaving me breathless and trembling, yet compelled forward, knowing that ordinary life was gone, that destiny had found me, and that the rogue wolf's cryptic guidance, the Alpha's quiet strength, and the forest's subtle orchestration had irrevocably altered the trajectory of everything I had ever known, culminating in a truth so profound, so unexpectedly monumental, that I could not yet fully grasp it but understood in the deepest part of me that nothing would ever be the same again. The forest, which had once been a sanctuary, began to feel like a living entity unsettled, its rhythms unpredictable, the air heavy with an energy that pressed against my chest and made each step forward feel uncertain, and as I moved with my pups close by, I could sense that nothing remained constant, that even the familiar paths had shifted in subtle ways. Roots rising where none had been, shadows stretching longer than the sun should allow, and the creek's gentle murmur taking on an edge, a tension that echoed the unrest growing inside me. The Alpha remained near, steady in presence yet visibly burdened, his amber eyes flicking to the trees, to the undergrowth, to the signs that only he seemed to read, and I realized that even his calm exterior could not mask the strain of forces pressing against us, testing our trust, our resolve, and our understanding of the world we thought we knew. Kael was never far, a dark silhouette in the distance, his glowing red eye cutting through the shadows with an intensity that made my stomach tighten, and he moved like a ghost between the trees, leaving subtle but unmistakable signs. A fallen branch pointing toward a hidden path, a rustle in the leaves that hinted at something watching, a whisper that seemed to drift on the wind. Every choice shifts the balance. Watch closely, Luna. The words, unspoken but clear in my mind, were a reminder that the forest, the Alpha, and even my own instincts were part of a larger puzzle, one I could not yet comprehend, and that each decision I made carried consequences that rippled far beyond my understanding. That day, as we navigated the dense underbrush, my pups growing restless and whimpering at unseen stimuli, I felt the first real pang of fear in weeks, a gnawing sense that the safety we had found was fragile, that the threads of trust and comfort could snap at any moment, and that the unseen forces around us, ancient, patient, and observing, were testing us, bending us toward choices that I had not yet prepared to face. The Alpha knelt to guide me over a tangled root, his hand brushing mine with the faintest pressure, and in that brief contact I felt a surge of connection and reassurance, yet beneath it lay a subtle tension, an unspoken warning that strength alone would not carry us through the challenges looming ahead. Kael appeared then, crouched on a ridge above the clearing, red eye fixed on me, and I sensed the weight of his scrutiny like a tangible force pressing into my thoughts, the forest holding its breath in tandem with my own heartbeat, and the wind carried his whisper again. The world shifts, stand where you must but do not falter. The warning stirred a whirlpool of emotion inside me. Fear, uncertainty, determination, and I realized that the ordinary life I had clung to had dissolved entirely, leaving me at the mercy of choice, instinct, and the subtle guidance of those I could neither fully see nor fully understand. Moments passed with an uncanny precision, the Alpha and I moving through the woods as though guided by some invisible current, Kael slipping between shadows, a phantom presence that both unnerved and reassured, and the pups sensing every nuance, their small bodies trembling and shifting against me, responding to energies I could only half perceive. I began to notice the forest reacting, leaves fluttering against our legs like silent messages, branches creaking in unnatural patterns, the water at the creek bending around stones in ways that seemed deliberate, as if the land itself were conscious of our passage and the weight of what we carried. The alpha spoke softly, not revealing all, but hinting at difficulties and unseen challenges, and I listened with a careful attention that sharpened my senses, making each sound, shadow, and flicker of light take on new significance, as though the forest had become both map and warning, and I could not rely solely on sight or instinct, but on intuition guided by subtle signs from both him and the rogue wolf. Kael's presence intensified, appearing closer than before, red eye glowing faintly through the trees, and I caught the faintest movements in the underbrush, branches shifted as if pointing the way, stones arranged in patterns that seemed deliberate, and the wind carried that same whisper with an edge that prickled the skin. Your next step may cost more than you know. The words, cryptic yet insistent, resonated deep within me, planting unease alongside a growing clarity that choice and consequence were intertwined, and that hesitation could no longer protect us. We had reached a moment where decisions would define the balance of safety, trust, and destiny. I turned to the alpha, watching the subtle tension in his jaw, the way his eyes scanned the horizon as though he were anticipating movement we could not yet see, and I understood that he too felt the instability pressing against our lives, that his quiet strength was not unbreakable but a fragile, honed focus meant to shield us from the forces converging on this forest and the delicate threads of our intertwined fates. Hours passed in this heightened awareness, each step a negotiation between caution and instinct, each glance toward the shadows a reminder that Kael's presence was never idle, never passive, but part of the forest's way of testing, warning, and guiding in equal measure. Then, as twilight approached and the sky darkened to a deep indigo, a sudden rustle near the creek startled my pups into yipping, and the alpha's hand shot toward mine, steadying me just as a branch snapped in a way that seemed far too precise, far too deliberate to be random. My heart leapt, a mixture of adrenaline and instinctive fear, and Kael's red eye flickered in the distance, unblinking and intense, and I knew in that instant that a decision had been forced upon us, a choice that could shift the fragile balance of safety we had fought to maintain, and that the consequences would extend beyond this moment, beyond the forest, beyond even our understanding. I glanced at the alpha, reading the tension in his posture, the silent question in his amber eyes, and I felt the weight of responsibility press against my chest like a living thing, the forest itself holding its breath as though waiting for my next move. And then as I took the first step toward action, guided partly by instinct, partly by the subtle signs Kael had left, and partly by the trust growing between the alpha and me, the wind swept through the clearing with a low howl that carried both warning and encouragement, and I realized in a sudden, breathtaking clarity that ordinary life had vanished completely, that the threads of destiny were tightening around us, and that the choices we made now, every glance, every step, every moment of courage, would determine not only our survival but the unfolding of a story far larger than I had ever imagined, leaving me trembling, alert, and irrevocably committed as the forest, the alpha, and the rogue wolf waited in suspense, the night pressing down with the promise of challenge, change, and revelation. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, painting the moss and leaves in gold and green, and in that quiet, sacred hour I felt the weight of stories long hidden pressing against my consciousness, stories not written in words but carried in memory, in instinct, in the subtle rhythms of survival and trust that shaped the alpha, the pack, and even myself. As my pups explored the clearing with tentative curiosity, I noticed the alpha watching them with a tenderness I had never seen before, his amber eyes softening with a mixture of pride, protectiveness, and a quiet sorrow that seemed to echo a history too heavy for casual words. And I realized for the first time that the strength he radiated had been forged in loss, in struggle, and in choices made under pressure I could barely imagine. His movements were deliberate yet gentle as he tended to the smallest needs, adjusting a fallen branch for shade, clearing the moss around the pups, and speaking softly to them in a cadence that seemed to hum with rhythm, almost like a lullaby from a life I could sense but had never known. And with every gesture, I felt layers of vulnerability peel away, revealing a man shaped as much by kindness as by hardship. I began to see the forest differently too, noticing how Kael's presence threaded through the shadows like an invisible thread binding moments together. A silent observer whose glowing red eye hinted at knowledge beyond my grasp, and in the faint rustle of leaves or the careful arrangement of fallen twigs, I sensed clues to the Alpha's past, to the pack's hidden stories, and even to my own history, which had been marked by quiet resilience and unspoken sacrifices that only now seemed to align with this unfolding destiny. Kael's whispers carried on the wind, faint but clear, like echoes of a forgotten language. Every wound, every fear, every secret has led you here. Look closer, Luna. I did look closer, noticing for the first time scars on the Alpha's hands, small but telling, evidence of battles fought not just with teeth and claws but with choices, with moral weight, with moments when he had had to protect others at his own expense, and I felt a swell of empathy that drew me closer even as a quiet tension hummed beneath my skin, a reminder that strength and vulnerability existed in tandem, and that to understand the Alpha fully, I would have to understand the pain he carried in silence. As we moved along the creek, he spoke finally, revealing fragments of his life, not as a boast but as a confession, telling of a time when the pack he had sworn to protect had fractured, when trust had been betrayed in small, precise ways that left lasting echoes in both the forest and his heart, and in listening, I understood that every decision he had made since then, the care of my pups, the way he observed and respected boundaries, the patience with which he approached me, was shaped by history, by the quiet echoes of emotional battles fought far from view. I found myself opening in response, sharing my own hidden truths, the stories of survival, the sleepless nights, the hunger, and the loneliness that had shaped me in ways I rarely allowed to surface. And in that exchange, a delicate thread of mutual understanding wove itself into our bond, fragile yet enduring, like a spider's silk stretched across the forest floor, invisible until caught by the light. Kael's presence remained constant, a shadow at the edge of my perception, a silent witness who seemed to nod in subtle acknowledgement of the truths revealed, as though approving, questioning, or simply marking the passage of events that mattered more than I yet realized. Every step I took seemed echoed by the forest itself, every glance toward the Alpha met with a glance back, and every twitch of a leaf or shiver of a branch carried meaning I could feel but not fully interpret. The hours stretched, a seamless mixture of ordinary tasks and extraordinary revelation, and I began to see how the Alpha's past had molded the decisions that shaped the present, how Kael's cryptic observation served as both guide and caution, and how my own resilience had been quietly preparing me for this unfolding reality, one in which emotional truth and survival were inseparable. As the sun rose higher, casting dappled patterns across the forest floor, the Alpha led me to a small clearing, where the remnants of an old fire pit spoke of moments long past, of gatherings and losses, of loyalty and betrayal, and he shared stories of the pack's history, the bonds that had held and broken it, and the role each wolf, each Luna, and each guardian had played in shaping the fragile equilibrium that now seemed to hang by a thread. I listened with awe and a deepening sense of connection, understanding that these stories were not just history but warnings, lessons, and maps for the future, and in hearing them, I felt a quiet responsibility settle in my chest, the realization that my place in this world was no longer optional, that choices mattered, and that understanding the past was essential to shaping the future. Then came the twist, subtle at first, revealed in a single gesture. The Alpha, whose eyes had been steady and amber all morning, faltered for the briefest instant, a shadow of fear or grief crossing his face, and I noticed Kael's red eye glinting with an intensity that pulled the air taut. It was in that split second, fleeting yet charged, that I understood the truth we had not yet spoken aloud, the secret the forest had been holding and the rogue wolf had been hinting at all along. The Alpha was not only carrying the weight of the pack's past but was entwined in a mystery that directly connected to my own lineage, a bond neither of us could have anticipated, a revelation that shifted every perception I held of safety, trust, and destiny. My breath caught, my pup sensed the change in energy and pressed closer, and Kael's whisper, carried faintly through the wind, slid into my mind like smoke curling around fire. The story you think you know is only a shadow of what must be faced. The emotional weight of that moment pressed against me, leaving me shaken, aware that the forest, the Alpha, and the rogue wolf were orchestrating a narrative far larger than survival or companionship, a narrative that demanded courage, awareness, and an embrace of truths that had been hidden, waiting for this precise moment to emerge, leaving me suspended between awe and dread, trust and uncertainty, and the undeniable sense that nothing No bond, no safety, no ordinary life would ever be the same again. The forest no longer felt like a sanctuary but a stage set for uncertainty, every sound amplified, every shadow elongated, and even the air seemed charged with expectation, pressing against my chest with a weight I could not shake as I moved cautiously with my pups clinging to my sides, while the alpha walked near me, his gaze scanning the edges of the trees, amber eyes sharp, alert, betraying a tension he did not voice, yet that I could feel as keenly as my own heartbeat, and I understood that even the moments of calm we had shared were fragile illusions, easily disturbed by forces unseen, by the currents of fate and the subtle manipulations of destiny that Kael, ever present in the shadows, had been hinting at with every faint rustle, every flash of red from his glowing eye, and every deliberate movement among the branches that seemed almost too precise to be random. The pups sensed it too, ears flicking at whispers of wind, tails stiffening as they pressed closer to me, and I realized that their instincts, sharper than my own, were attuned to the undercurrents that Kael wove like invisible threads through our lives, and that survival was no longer measured by food or rest but by attentiveness, intuition, and trust that was now being tested with subtle but insistent precision. The alpha spoke little, offering only glances, gestures, and an occasional low murmur that seemed more a question than a statement, and I found myself reading between words, trying to anticipate needs, interpret silences, and hold the fragile balance of our bond in a forest that had grown unpredictable, the trees leaning as though listening, the creek murmuring in a cadence that seemed urgent, and every small detail carrying a significance I could barely comprehend. Kael moved silently through the underbrush, never approaching directly, yet I felt the pull of his presence, the way his red eye caught the light just enough to imprint a warning on my mind, the whisper of his message curling through the air like smoke. Do not trust what seems certain. The threads are fraying. Each moment he lingered was a reminder that appearances were fragile, that hope was delicate, and that unseen challenges were pressing ever closer, bending our choices into directions neither I nor the alpha could fully predict. As the day waned, the forest itself seemed to tighten around us, shadows stretching unnaturally, the undergrowth rustling with the faintest indications of movement, and I realized that we were no longer moving through ordinary space but navigating a web of forces, each step amplified by the weight of unseen observers and hidden currents, and that any misstep could unravel the fragile sense of stability we had so painstakingly built. The alpha guided me to a small clearing, where sunlight broke in fractured patterns through the canopy, and I felt the tension coiling in the pit of my stomach, sensing that a test awaited, though its form remained concealed, a riddle pressed against the edges of perception, leaving me alert, anxious, yet unwilling to retreat. Kael's presence intensified as the wind shifted, carrying a faint cryptic message in its sigh. The moment comes. Choose or be forced apart. I looked toward the trees, my pulse quickening, the pups stiffening at the subtle tension in the forest, and I felt the alpha's hand brush mine in a fleeting contact, grounding yet urgent, a silent plea for awareness and trust as we faced an invisible challenge, a trial shaped by destiny and observed by the rogue wolf with unwavering attention. Moments stretched taut, the forest breathing around us, and every instinct I possessed screamed that something unseen was moving closer, testing not only our bond but the limits of courage, patience, and resilience, as though the entire world had conspired to place us at the edge of understanding, forcing decisions we could not yet articulate, but could feel in the tightening of muscles, the quickened heartbeat, the subtle shifts in the air, and the glint of red that never left my mind. Then came a sudden disturbance, a rustle in the undergrowth too deliberate to be chance, a pattern in fallen leaves suggesting a path not yet taken, and a fleeting glimpse of Kael's shadow disappearing between trees, signaling urgency, a warning I could not ignore. And as I looked back at the alpha, his gaze met mine, eyes shadowed with both determination and an unspoken hesitation, and I understood that the path ahead demanded separation, a temporary distance to navigate the unseen forces pressing against us, a move that would stretch trust to its limits and test the bond we had cultivated in ways the forest and Kael's cryptic guidance had been preparing us for all along. My chest tightened, the pups whining softly against my legs, and a shiver of anticipation ran through me, the wind carrying Kael's final whisper before retreating into shadow. The threads are fragile. Stand firm, or you will be tested alone. The forest seemed to hold its breath as I took a cautious step forward, the alpha stepping back slightly, creating the gap that destiny required, and I felt a surge of both fear and resolve, knowing that in this moment every choice mattered, every instinct would be scrutinized, and the invisible tension pressing against us would shape what came next, leaving me suspended on the edge of uncertainty, aware that hope could falter, trust could be strained, and yet a path forward, illuminated in subtle signs and guided by unseen hands, remained, beckoning me into the unfolding story, one step at a time, with Kael watching, waiting, and whispering that the resolution, or the unraveling, was closer than I realized. The forest had become charged, every leaf trembling with anticipation, every shadow seeming to hold its breath, as I moved through the clearing with the Alpha close yet distant, his amber eyes locked on the space ahead, reflecting not only the fading sunlight but the weight of choices we could no longer avoid, and I could feel the tension in the air like an invisible current, pressing against me, testing the strength of our connection and the depth of courage we had cultivated together. The pups clung to my sides, sensing the gravity of the moment, their small bodies taut with awareness, and even the wind seemed to pause, carrying with it the faint rustle of Kael's presence, the rogue wolf, a shadowy observer whose glowing red eye gleamed from the periphery, a silent guardian and enigmatic manipulator whose cryptic influence had guided us through every trial up to this point. I could feel the Alpha's steadying hand brush mine as we approached a natural amphitheater carved by the roots and stones of the forest, and his voice, low and urgent, broke the silence with careful words that were at once comforting and cautionary, reminding me that the confrontation we faced required not only strength but clarity, discernment, and unwavering trust, while Kael's eyes, glinting through the shifting shadows, seemed to measure our readiness, silently assessing whether we were prepared to navigate the unseen forces pressing against us. Then it began, the subtle signs of disruption. A shifting of light that felt unnatural, a whispering breeze that carried messages we could only half decipher, the creek murmuring in rhythms that hinted at challenges, and the forest itself leaning in, its canopy swaying as though anticipating the storm that was coming, a collision of destiny and choice that we could not evade. And in that moment, the Alpha and I were forced to confront not just external pressures but the emotional storms within ourselves, the fears we had held close, the doubts that had whispered when the forest was quiet, and the truths we had only begun to share. Kael's presence was a constant, moving strategically at the edges of perception, sometimes manifesting as a shadow in the trees, sometimes as the sudden snap of a branch that drew attention just long enough to guide us or warn us, and in every subtle intervention, I sensed the rogue wolf was both protector and provocateur, orchestrating awareness while leaving the confrontation to unfold through our own choices, a reminder that destiny required action and understanding in equal measure. The Alpha stepped forward, his gaze sharp, voice steady as he acknowledged the tensions that had risen, the pressures that had frayed the edges of trust, and the decisions that would now define not only our immediate survival but the trajectory of the bonds we had forged with each other and the forest itself. And I felt my own resolve crystallize, a combination of fear, determination, and the deep emotional connection that had grown between us through trials, revelations, and subtle moments of understanding that neither of us could have anticipated. The forest reacted to our focus, shadows deepening, sunlight fragmenting through the canopy into intricate patterns, and the air vibrating with anticipation as if every tree, every stone, and every leaf were holding its breath, waiting to see how the confrontation would unfold. While Kael's red eye gleamed from a ridge above, a reminder that every observation mattered, every instinct was scrutinized, and every subtle choice carried weight. Then came the critical moment, a decision I had long dreaded yet instinctively knew was inevitable. The path forward demanded sacrifice, the acknowledgement that not every outcome could be controlled, that not every risk could be mitigated, and that courage sometimes required stepping into the unknown with nothing but trust as a guide. The Alpha's hand tightened on mine, his amber eyes locking with mine in a silent pact, a shared understanding that what we were about to face would test everything we had built, everything we had believed, and everything we were willing to endure. Kael's presence became sharper, the red gleam of his eye cutting through the shadows like a warning and a promise, and I felt the forest itself respond, the creek's babble quickening into a rhythm that seemed to mirror the rapid beating of my own heart, the wind shifting with a charged intent, and the distant cry of a bird slicing through the air, emphasizing that this confrontation was not only physical but emotional, psychological, and spiritual, a full-spectrum trial that demanded the unity of all senses and all bonds. The Alpha's voice broke again, steady but urgent, outlining the choices that lay before us, the potential sacrifices, and the delicate balance of trust that must be maintained. while Kael moved closer, a silent shadow guiding attention to subtle signs, a fallen branch here, a pattern in the leaves there, an almost imperceptible cue that influenced timing, perception, and decision, leaving me aware that every movement, every glance, every step we took had meaning beyond what the eye could see. The confrontation escalated as we reached the center of the clearing, and the weight of emotional truth pressed upon me, revealing vulnerabilities, unspoken fears, and the magnitude of responsibility that rested on our shoulders. The Alpha mirrored that realization, his movements precise yet charged with the raw energy of someone fully aware that each choice could alter outcomes irrevocably, while Kael's red eye seemed to burn brighter in the shifting shadows, a spectral witness to our trials, and a reminder that the rogue wolf's cryptic influence could tip the balance in ways subtle yet profound. And then it happened, the cinematic, tension-filled moment when the forest seemed to hold its breath entirely. The light fractured into 1,000 slivers, shadows coalesced into shapes that hinted at unseen forces, and a sudden gust of wind swept through, scattering leaves and echoing a warning I could not ignore. The Alpha and I were pulled apart in a single heartbeat by circumstances neither of us controlled, the gap between us charged with tension, emotional and instinctive, as Kael's red eye lingered on the separation, unblinking, a silent marker that the next phase of our journey would demand courage, clarity, and trust beyond anything we had yet faced, leaving me suspended in the clearing, heart racing, mind sharp with anticipation, and breath caught as the forest whispered around me that the story was far from over, that the choices made in the next moments would define destiny itself, and that the rogue wolf, ever present, would continue to watch, guide, and challenge in ways I could only begin to imagine, setting the stage for the final act where every bond, every secret, and every lesson would collide in a resolution yet unseen, leaving the audience suspended, aware that the cinematic climax had arrived, and that the journey forward would demand everything we had learned, everything we had trusted, and everything we were willing to risk. The forest pulsed with a rhythm that felt alive, each rustle of leaves, each shift in shadow carrying the weight of destiny, and as I stepped into the clearing where the final confrontation had begun to take shape, I felt the culmination of every choice, every revelation, every bond we had forged rise within me, a swelling current of emotion that pressed against my chest and sharpened every sense, making the air itself seem electric, tinged with anticipation, fear, and a fragile hope that could break or endure with equal ease. The Alpha stood near, steady yet vulnerable, amber eyes reflecting the filtered sunlight through the trees. And in that gaze I read the quiet truth that we were no longer simply two beings bound by circumstance but entwined by forces far larger than ourselves, forces that had shaped the forest, the pack, and even the subtle guidance of Kael, whose presence lingered at the periphery like a living shadow, red eye glowing faintly in rhythm with the pulse of the woods, a constant reminder that even as we faced this ultimate moment, unseen hands guided the unfolding of events in ways we could barely comprehend. The Alpha's hand brushed mine, a gesture of reassurance and solidarity, and the forest seemed to respond to the touch, sunlight fracturing into intricate patterns on the ground, leaves quivering as if echoing our hearts, and I felt every fear, every doubt, every unspoken longing converge into a single point of clarity, that the choices we made now would ripple through time, shaping not only our lives but the lives of those bound to us by blood, trust, and destiny. Kael moved closer, a silent observer until his voice, low and measured, cut through the tension like a thread of shadow and flame. The path of truth demands what the heart fears most. The words lingered in the air, cryptic yet precise, and I felt their meaning seep into my bones, a reminder that transformation, revelation, and the fulfillment of destiny often required a surrender that was both internal and profound, a letting go of the familiar, the safe, and the ordinary, in order to embrace the extraordinary that had always been waiting in the forest's depths. I saw the Alpha's gaze falter for just a fraction of a second, a shadow of vulnerability crossing the strength he projected so effortlessly, and I realized that even he bore burdens invisible to the eye, truths he had carried in silence that now pressed against the delicate equilibrium we had built, forcing acknowledgement, confrontation, and ultimately, trust so complete that it demanded courage beyond instinct. As the pups pressed against my legs, their small bodies trembling with awareness of the charged energy around us, I understood that the forest itself was a participant in this emotional crescendo, the creek's gentle babble rising and falling like a heartbeat, the wind shifting with deliberate purpose, and the shadows lengthening and twisting into shapes that seemed almost to breathe, reflecting the inner turbulence of our hearts. the hidden histories of the Alpha, and the silent guidance of Kael, who watched from the edges with an intensity that left no room for doubt, only awareness. The moment stretched, a tension-filled interlude where past and present, fear and hope, love and duty intertwined, and I felt my own vulnerabilities laid bare, the remnants of hesitation, uncertainty, and self-doubt dissolving in the face of a truth I could no longer ignore. That destiny had not merely brought the Alpha and me together but had been guiding every step of my journey, shaping instincts, decisions, and the quiet resilience that had carried me through trials I had thought insurmountable. Kael's gaze shifted, a subtle movement that drew my attention, and in that instant I sensed the rogue wolf's deeper purpose, a force neither fully understood nor fully seen, yet integral to the unfolding narrative, a balance between guidance and challenge, presence and distance, that allowed the Alpha and me to confront not just the external forces of the forest, but the internal landscapes of our hearts. The Alpha spoke then, voice low, resonant, and filled with an urgency that carried both warning and reassurance, articulating truths we had only glimpsed in fragments until now, acknowledging the stakes, the fragility of the bonds at risk, and the need for courage that surpassed instinct, the need to trust fully in one another, even when uncertainty and fear demanded retreat. And I felt a surge of clarity and determination rise within me, a recognition that love, trust, and destiny were inseparable, each feeding the other, and that to embrace this moment fully meant accepting transformation in ways both subtle and profound. The forest seemed to respond, the light shifting, the shadows deepening, the breeze curling around us as if aware of the magnitude of the moment, and I felt every heartbeat, every pulse of emotion, resonate in tandem with the Alphas, with the Pups, and with the unseen forces that Kael represented, a synchronicity that left me both awed and vulnerable, aware that the choices we were making now would echo in ways unimaginable, shaping not only the immediate outcome but the long arc of the pack, the forest, and the roles we were destined to play. And then, as if the forest itself exhaled, a subtle yet profound shift occurred. A realization that the Alpha and I were no longer acting independently, that the bonds we had forged, the lessons we had learned, and the challenges we had endured had culminated in a moment of alignment, where trust, courage, and emotional truth merged, and yet, with that understanding came the bittersweet recognition that transformation required release, that something had to be surrendered, if not in the world, then within ourselves, a quiet sacrifice that would mark the passage from uncertainty to clarity, from fear to acceptance, from ordinary existence to a destiny interwoven with love, purpose, and responsibility. I felt it in my chest, a contraction of emotion, a pulse of awareness, a gentle letting go that did not diminish but elevated. As Kael's red eye flickered one final time in acknowledgement, and I sensed the rogue wolf's message in its entirety, that guidance, warning, and observation were his domain, but the choices, courage, and transformation were ours, and that the ultimate truth lay in the acceptance of both love and duty, intertwined and inseparable. As the light fractured through the canopy, golden and soft, illuminating the clearing in a way that made every leaf, every stone, every shadow glow with meaning, I felt the Alpha step closer, hand on mine, his presence steady, grounding, and yet filled with the unspoken acknowledgement of the sacrifices we had faced, the risks we had endured, and the destiny that had shaped us. And in that moment, suspended between fear, awe, and overwhelming emotion, I realized that we had reached the emotional peak, the apex of trust, understanding, and love, a moment that demanded surrender and courage in equal measure, leaving the forest, the Pups, the Alpha, and even Kael in perfect balance, poised on the threshold of resolution. And I knew with absolute certainty that what came next would define everything, while the rogue wolf's silent presence, cryptic words, and glowing red eye served as the final reminder that destiny is never passive, that love and trust are tested in ways both visible and unseen, and that subtle sacrifice is often the true measure of transformation. The forest, once tense with unseen currents and the weight of choices, seemed to exhale a gentle golden light as dawn crept across the canopy, illuminating the moss, leaves, and creek in a soft glow that felt like both a beginning and an ending. And I walked among the familiar trees with the Alpha by my side, feeling a profound sense of completeness settle into my chest, a quiet confirmation that the trials, revelations, and subtle tests we had endured had shaped not only our bond but the fabric of the world we were entrusted to protect, and that love, trust, and destiny had intertwined in ways that were visible in every gesture, glance, and heartbeat between us. The Pups scampered ahead, their small, joyful energy a reminder that life carried forward, that innocence, and resilience would continue to flourish, and that the choices we made, tempered by courage, understanding, and empathy, had created a space where hope could take root again, unshaken by past uncertainties. The Alpha's hand brushed mine, steady and reassuring, and in that touch I felt the echo of every shared struggle, every quiet conversation, every moment of tension and release, and I knew with absolute clarity that our journey had transformed us, melding our hearts and instincts in a way that could never be undone, a union of purpose and emotion forged through experience, and yet still open to the mysteries that the forest, destiny, and the rogue wolf Kael embodied had always promised. Kael lingered at the periphery, his dark, muscular form partially obscured by shadow, the faint glow of his red eye catching the first rays of sunlight, and though he moved silently, I felt the weight of his presence, a reminder that guidance, observation, and subtle influence had been with us from the start, and that his role was never fully understood, even as it shaped our choices and tested our courage. A soft, distant howl rolled through the trees, carrying on the wind like a message both farewell and warning, and I felt a shiver of awe, realizing that Kael's enigmatic presence, while never fully explained, was an enduring thread in the tapestry of our lives, a guardian, a provocateur, and a witness to the unfolding of destiny. The forest seemed at peace, yet charged with the quiet promise of continuity, the sunlight catching on dew like scattered stars, the creek murmuring in gentle cadence, and every leaf, every stone, every shadow now imbued with the memory of what had passed, what had been learned, and what would carry forward, a living record of courage, choice, and connection. I looked at the Alpha, amber eyes reflecting the light, strength, and vulnerability in perfect balance, and I understood that the bond we shared was no longer measured by proximity or need, but by understanding, empathy, and the unspoken knowledge that we could face whatever future awaited, together or apart, with hearts aligned and instincts intertwined. The air was alive with subtle movement, the sway of branches, the flutter of leaves, the soft echo of distant calls from the forest inhabitants, and the pups tumbled at our feet, unaware of the cosmic weight of the day but embodying the pure, unguarded joy that reminded me why we had endured, why we had chosen trust, and why we had embraced the full spectrum of emotion, revelation, and responsibility. Each step forward was a conscious act of hope, a reaffirmation that even in a world governed by unseen forces, courage and love remained the strongest constants, shaping not only the moment but the endless possibilities that lay ahead. Kael moved once more through the shadows, a silent streak of black and red, and in his movement, there was the hint of farewell and continuity, a suggestion that though this chapter had reached its resolution, the forest, the pack, and the rogue wolf's cryptic influence would linger, ever present, waiting to challenge, guide, and shape the next moment, the next story, in ways subtle but unforgettable. His distant howl, carried on the wind, seemed to reverberate through the canopy and into my chest, a haunting yet comforting sound that spoke of vigilance, mystery, and the eternal dance between freedom and destiny, a reminder that though closure had arrived, the world was vast, unpredictable, and alive, filled with unseen forces that moved in tandem with our choices. I took a deep breath, the crisp morning air filling my lungs, and as I looked toward the horizon where the sun had risen fully, golden and warm, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, relief, and purpose, the culmination of every trial, every secret revealed, every bond strengthened, converging into a single palpable moment of harmony. The Alpha's gaze met mine, steady and knowing, and we shared a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement that our journey was far from ordinary, that destiny had shaped us, that love had endured, and that together we were stronger than any unseen current, any shadow, or any challenge that might come. Finally, I lifted my gaze toward the distant ridge where Kael's shadow had lingered, and though he was already slipping into the depths of the forest, his presence remained, etched into my memory, a symbol of the balance between mystery and guidance, between danger and protection, between the known and the unknowable, and I knew that while this chapter had closed, the lessons, the bonds, and the echoes of the rogue wolf's cryptic influence would carry forward, shaping the pack, the forest, and our lives in ways subtle, profound, and enduring. The sunlight glinted off his fading red eye one last time before he melted entirely into shadow, leaving behind a memory, a whisper, and a promise that destiny and mystery were never truly gone. And as the Alpha and I stood side by side, pups at our feet, in the golden glow of morning, I felt an overwhelming sense of completion and continuity, the forest alive, the bonds unbroken, and the future wide open, waiting for the next story to unfold. under the watchful eyes of the unseen, the guardian, and the rogue wolf who had guided us from the shadows.